by playing with this material and being very, very subtle with it, you get these really beautiful shifts.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Beyond the Palette. I'm your host, Whitney Rosenson, the owner and president of Art Dimensions, Inc. I'm really excited because today I will be chatting with an awesome painter and old friend, Shingo Francis. Hi, Shingo. How are you?
Hi, Whitney. I'm doing well.
Awesome. Welcome to the Art Dimensions podcast, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So, Shingo, we've known each other for many years, since high school, actually, in the 80s, although we went to different high schools in Los Angeles, but we had friends in common and spent a good amount of time together back then. And I know you went to Crossroads, but I need to ask, I'm curious about this. Did Crossroads High School help prepare you for your career as an artist? And if so, how?
That's a very interesting question. Being a school for arts and science, it had a very robust art program, which I would say, I partially took advantage of since my father and my mother were both artists. I wasn't quick to kind of follow their path. There was some resistance in me. But earlier, before I really became conscious of this, not wanting to follow the path of my parents, which ultimately, here I am a painter, but I took a class in video art in 8th grade. Although my mother was a video artist, I didn't really put the two together because her films and videos were quite narrative. Her topics and content were quite, for me, especially as a young adolescent, quite heavy. I looked at it more as we were watching a lot of surf videos. MTV was just beginning back then, and
Right?
watching all those
Back in the 80s?
in the 80s. Yeah, the MTV videos. I took video art with this idea of creating my own videos about what is interesting to me. Although that class didn't last more than a year, I believe, the year that I did take it really gave me confidence in the ability to write, shoot, edit my own chapters, I would say stories that I wanted to create.
That's more video, obviously videography, but
Yeah.
did you love art and painting as a child?
Well, as a child, yeah, my father in his studio, he would set up a corner for us to paint. That was my early, I would say, introduction to painting. And of course, it was for fun and also for him to keep us entertained when it was kind of his turn to watch us, for example. And also, I think he wanted to kind of get us to be creative, not to be watching something, not to always be entertained by somebody, but to focus on something. So that was really an early memory, and I kept it up till I started to kind of push back and say, I'm not going to do what my parents did. So it was about I would say, 12-year practice I had in my father's studio.
I read an interview you gave where you talk about moving to the States from Japan. I think you were about 12 or 13.
Hmm.
And you said that it was such a culture shock, but that it was also your foundation for becoming an artist.
Yeah. Well, it was such a jolt on one hand because I left my mother's world in a sense. Every summer we came to live with our dad during the summers when I was living in Japan, which was from the age of 3 to 12. But then to kind of to move at 12, 13, move out away from my mother to move in with my father, it's a big disruption on one hand.
Yeah. To move continents when you're 13.
Yeah, and I think for me, I mean, I was familiar with my dad's life here in the US and LA, coming back in the summers. And so we had that continuity in the culture and what have you. But I think looking back, the biggest event was the fact that I kind of moved out away from my mother. then living with my father, fortunately, there were a lot of people in my father's life around the house because it wasn't conventional. He wasn't remarried yet. There were men who took us under their wings. It was kind of a community, taught me how to surf, taught even, eventually me and my friends, about certain things about life, what to do, what not to do, what is kind of right and what is kind of wrong. So it's kind of going into what they call anthropology wise, that it's like going into a men's longhouse. That transition really, was a big event in my life, forced me to kind of look at my feelings and my thoughts. And also, I think that kind of mourning of moving away from the mother's house really was, I needed to place those feelings and thoughts into something. Eventually, with writing, and then that video class I took, and then down the line with painting, it was
The foundation. Yeah.
yeah, like a foundation.
Before people, I don't want people guessing. Let's just mention who your father was. Your father was Sam Francis, so well known and regarded and respected in the art world. With your father being who he was, did that influence your desire to paint?
Since I grew up watching both my mother and my father, and also people who were around the house, a lot of artists came and spent time with us. Everyone was talking about, and then also seeing with my mother and my father, seeing their respective studios, that making something, making things, creating something was a valuable, was like a mission, like a valuable thing to do. That's what, and on one hand, it's kind of like, oh, that's what people do. And there was a lot of talk about that as well with the other artists who were in the house when they would talk about their paintings or talk about their sculptures, even filmmaking. That influenced me. Yeah. Maybe on one hand, I didn't have much perspective outside of that, but I was also very interested. It's interesting because my brother grew up in the same environment, but he went in a completely different direction. I think something inside of me already existed where I wanted to make things, create.
Create, yeah. So
Yeah.
interesting. What inspires you today?
Well, I've been using this new material. It's called interference. It has two sides to it, meaning it uses a light spectrum for us to see color. So when you use this material and you paint with it could be suspended in a liquid form. They're mica particles, meaning very small particles. They're cut at an angle so that when the light reflects off of the surface that's coated with this material,
Is it like a resin?
it's like a oil paint. It could be oil or acrylic paint. Yeah, it looks just like paint. It comes in a tube or it comes in a jar or in a powder form, but you mix it in with medium. And so when the light hits and it reflects back to you, that angle determines what color you're going to see, just like in a rainbow. The rainbows start, they have a range of the spectrum of color you can see because the light is hitting the raindrops coming back to us. The low to the high, the angles give you the different colors in the rainbow. So from blue down to yellow. It's the same way. The angle and the cut and the mica particles allow you to see that specific color depending on the angle of the cut. And so when it's not reflecting, it's ambient light, you're seeing the opposite colors. So a blue will look a little orangish yellow, a violet will look a little bit greenish, red a little bluish. So I've been working with this new material, and I've been always very into subtlety, our perception. If we really dial into our perception and we really look at the different color variants, for example, or just how light hits something, by playing with this material and being very, very subtle with it, you get these really beautiful shifts that I'm right now very inspired to explore. I've been influenced and interested in light and space artists
For many years, right?
for many years, yeah. And of course, being here, living in Southern California, the artists, this movement, light and space, grew mostly out of Southern California. Seeing the artists' works here in LA and well, outside of LA as well, gave me this affinity with the landscape, the light, and then also these artists who are working with this phenomenology.
So is there a particular body of work what's that you use the interference with? What would that body of work be called?
Well, I call it as it is interference,
Okay.
and they have various structures and forms, and I'm using them in different ways as far as composition and what have you. This is kind of like a material that has recently been available to fine artists, and especially in oil paint. And so I've been really exploring what it can do.
I can't wait to see some of those pieces. I think I've seen one in your studio, but they're just beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
I have to ask this question because we're in a pandemic.
Okay.
Has your process been affected by COVID at all?
Oh yeah, it has. I want just that, energy that we have to deal with, that reality. I took that and decided to do one drawing for that day. In that drawing, place what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, maybe what I'm hearing, what's going around, and just give it a expression.
Where can our listeners see these?
Oh, you could go to my Instagram page or my Facebook page, Shingo Francis.
Wonderful. What do you credit your success as an artist to?
Success, Success is a interesting word. I feel very lucky. I have to say, of course, having a father who was an artist and a mother who was an artist gave me the kind of strange faith that if you continue and do what you do, possibly you can make a living out doing this. Your identity as an artist can be legitimized. I think a lot of people just even, to deal with that is a lot. But I think my success, I think one is just perseverance. There's so many times in my life where, you just kind of lose your way, meaning in the creative process. It could be that there's so much you want to do, there's so many roads to take. Which direction should I go? And there's only so much time and energy that you have. You could also be questioning yourself, like, am I good enough? There's a lot of envy that could boil up or jealousy that could boil up when you see other people doing really well. And it's easy to kind of have this voice that maybe says, like, oh, you're not good enough. So there's a lot of battles that you personally and then externally that you have to deal with because you got to make art. Making is the most important, but then also getting your art out, which also means you have to meet people and you have to meet the right people eventually who will help you get the work out there, like you. Little did we know when we are younger that we'll be working together like this. But we need people like you. We need people
Thank
to
you.
help us get the work
Into the world.
into the world. Yeah.
Yeah. But your success, I mean, I consider you a successful artist. And so I want to ask you this. What advice would you give to a new artist?
There's several things. One is not to be too hard on yourself. I think there comes a time when, you get really hard on yourself regarding your work. Like, oh, it's not good enough. Well, they call it a practice because just like any practice, you have to keep at it and you eventually, start doing things that actually, a lot of my work that I've made, I look back maybe even the day after, but it could be even a few years after where I'm like, wow, I made that, and that feeling of this thing, this object, this image, painting came from me, and having that honest, which doesn't happen all the time. But I think for me, it's kind of like chasing that is really important and keeps me going.
Hmm.
Another one is to have your cohorts. You got to have your friends. You got to develop relationships. We don't do this in a isolation. You help each other as well. That's really, really important. If you feel like your friend's work matches what this person's looking for or what have you, try to make those connections happen.
Because you're in your studio. I mean, you're isolated in your studio. Many artists are,
Hmm.
and you need those outlets.
Yeah, you need that community.
Mhm.
We are a community. I think the kind of lone wolf, I'm just going to look out for myself mentality is it's destructive, actually. Having that community and then going and doing residencies, getting out there.
Can you tell us a little? You've done a couple residencies or maybe more than 2.
When I was living in New York, I went to Art My, which is a residency that's upstate. It's quite short, it's about a month. But they give you a studio. You're kind of thrown in to a whole community of about 40 visual artists. You have a roommate, you eat together, you have a space to work in. They have an open studio at the very end, but about 2, 3 days a week, you'll have studio visits that you could sign up for.
And how many hours a day do you paint during that
Well,
month?
you could paint any hours besides you want they want you to show up for dinner for sure, and then lunch. It's usually you take a break and you eat with everybody. Breakfast is just kind of you grab something and go to your studio.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh yeah, yeah, I enjoyed it. I made a lot of good connections for my work. I got a lot of great feedback from these people who came through because there would be critics, curators, gallerists, writers, other artists coming through. And then I also made lifelong friends who I'm still, they're very important friends in my life.
So that was called Art.
Oh my, OMI,
Oh,
Art Oh
OMI.
My.
And what about the Hatch?
Oh, the hatch. So the hatch was this is another I think a good thought, for a younger artist. So when I was starting off, it's hard to afford to have a separate studio from your living studio. So I rented storefront with another artist friend and we built out the back, put a little kitchen in and a loft, and then we just used the front as our studio. But then the city, which was Culver City at the time, came knocking on the door and said, "You got to have this as a business. You can't just." And then they came to the back and said, "Oh, you're living back here. That's not really,
Is that legal?
it's not really legal." Yeah. They said, "Well, look at, we'll just turn a blind eye on this. You got to get a seller's permit. You got to get a business license. You got to like do something. Just if you keep it on the weekend, open on the weekends, that's great." Oh, I, did all that. The hatch was a name that I gave to, we were young artists who were like, let's hatch something new. That was the hatch. And so it was a gallery space that had shows, and I invited friends to show first and then other curators. And yeah, it was a great space. It was really a good way for me to learn about the other side of the art world too, which was the selling part and the exhibiting part. And I thought that was an important lesson for me going forward because when I started working with curators or being in gallery shows, to be timely with things, understanding where they're at was an important, like getting into their mindset. Like, why is it important?
That's great advice for someone who's just starting out as an artist. Shingo, I know you have 3 different bodies of work, one being the interference series, one the monochrome series, and one the band series. Can you briefly tell us the differences amongst those?
The monochrome series developed and it's still developing. It's been a 20-year journey for that series now, which is quite a long time for one series, but
It's amazing that you've been focused on that for that long.
yeah, it's an image that has so much to keep mining in a sense, to keep working with. Because I started with just one color and then eventually, like 10 years later, I added other colors. So it's like a very slow process. And there's this kind of very thin line at the bottom and then it opens up at the top and bottom. So that's its iteration at the moment. And the name changed from Blues Silence to Infinite Space. So when people look at my work, they could kind of see that transition as they also look at the titles. And then the bands, That started off as just some very subtle horizontal lines, or even just one line on work on paper that I kept on exploring.
Are they all on paper?
No, then they go on to canvas too. Then I started to do them on canvas. That series took a big turn when I did my residency at Governor's Island in New York City through the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. I was taking a boat between this little island from Lower Manhattan back to Manhattan, and I was doing those, and I was looking at the horizon. But then what I realized was being in this big city in Manhattan, Brooklyn, New York City, all the bustling and the sounds and the noise. And then you take this little short trip, it's like 15 minutes, and just hop over to Governor's Island, and it's just a whole different world over there. So that transition, I started to expand the center of the band. It was just you could just imagine just a lot of gestures in the middle. It kind of like opened up another space within that gesture. Then I started exploring this second or third space within the plane of the canvas or paper. Now I do them in various colors, but there's a very solid band that goes right through the center. And then there's gestures at the top and bottom. And that center started to become more of an inner space, and then the top and bottom representing the exterior space and through our senses, what we experience and what happens outside of us, but also this kind of very thin membrane that exists between our thoughts and feelings and what's going on outside of us, and how that membrane is really what we kind of have control of. It's never completely sealed,
Right.
it's never completely gone. I think we kind of live within that balance. That series has been based on that concept.
And then you have the interference series.
Yeah,
I just want to say I find your paintings very soothing and very I have a strong emotional connection to your work. Do you feel like your paintings, all three bodies of work, can help heal?
I've had people tell me that through this really difficult time, some of my work, yeah, has really helped them. And there's been people wanting to come and buy some of the work and
It's
say,
amazing.
what I saw, I really got attracted to helping. And well, for me too, I think we express what we experience. If we could infuse some of that expression with our own thoughts and feelings of what's possible, meaning that it's your attitude, essentially, that you shift your attitude in a way that you're not so overwhelmed or veer towards despair, for example, that if you could shift. And so that shift, trying to take the strength and my own experience of being through my own tough situations and getting through them and infusing some of that. Hope is a difficult word for me. Yeah, definitely hope.
I mean, I feel that in your paintings when I look at your work.
Oh, thanks. Thanks.
Yeah. And was that your intention?
Yeah, I just hope is a bit nebulous sometimes. I want it to be a little bit more concrete. I try to use the word maybe joy. I think we all feel joy. We all feel hope too, but hope is, where is it going? It gets a little bit, joy is a little more concrete for me. And eventually, if we could get to the place of bliss, and that maybe going back to what been interesting me or inspiring me lately is trying to make space, because bliss is a pretty interesting word.
Yeah.
It's almost like, does it really exist? Can you
Right.
really be
Well,
in bliss?
it's a goal. It's a goal.
It's a goal,
It's like
right?
nirvana. Yeah.
It's like nirvana. It's like, but I think we can have moments of bliss if we allow ourselves.
I agree.
That's the $1 million question, is everyone has their own way of allowing yourself to do it.
And before I let you go, thank you so much. Your paintings that you do every day, what
Hmm.
sizes are those?
About 15 by 11 is the average size, because that's just the way I cut the paper a lot. But other ones could be the full size paper, meaning they're 30 by 22, or Then there's some odd ones that could be very narrow and long, or they vary, but most of them are 15 by 11, mostly.
I love those daily paintings. I think they're amazing. And you're still working on those, I assume.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was doing them every day, and lately I've been giving myself a break when I need to. It's not about,
How many?
yeah, or like, I must and have to. That's not really the point. But every day for a while, and then maybe I'll take a break for a day or two, but they're still called daily drawings.
Daily drawings. Okay, I want everyone to check out the daily drawings on Shingo's Instagram, which is at Shingo Francis.
Yes.
So, Shingo, is there anything else you want the listeners to know about you before we sign off?
Surfing, it's been a big part of my life. I just want to throw that in there. I've, kind of kept it separate for a long time, but recently I've been realizing that what I'm seeing in nature, whether it's looking out at the ocean or bringing that into the mountains or the desert, that other practice of surfing where you sit on the board, and because you do a lot of wading, that observational skill, I think, has really, I've realized, found its way into my work. So, as you were saying, the simplicity and the subtleties, there's a lot of that going on in nature as well,
Hmm.
when you really sit there with it.
And you meditate, and that's something that influences your paintings as well.
Yeah, yeah, meditating is, to get myself centered, and I try to paint from, what I call the core, which means kind of like your belly area. That's where the energy, that's where I want myself to reside more, in my core and my heart, as opposed to just the head. Because
Yeah, I
the
understand.
head is great. I love thinking and everything, but it also could become very distracting.
Shingo, this was so great and so much fun. I really appreciate you talking with me and giving us a glimpse into your creative process.
Thank you, Whitney. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shingo, and thank you, artists and listeners, for tuning in to Art Dimensions Beyond the Palette. Make sure to follow on your favorite platform, follow us on Good Pods, and tell a friend about the podcast. As always, you can check out the works of artists on this show by visiting artdimensionsonline.com. Happy creating!